Before Bill Wilson, alcoholism was often a death sentence. And because of Bill Wilson, we now have ways to treat alcoholism and understand alcoholism and allow people to live wonderful lives, which they wouldn't have been able to do before Bill Wilson and Alcoholics Anonymous. So born in 1894, sorry about this, Bill Wilson was one of the most influential men of the 20th century. He was not a saint. He chain smoked, he took LSD, he cheated on his wife, but he was a hero. AA was founded in 1935 and has grown to have more than 2 million members at least in hundreds of countries all over the world, and there are millions of meetings. But what's even more amazing than the way AA has expanded are the dozens of other 12-step programs that AA has thrown off. In other words, it expanded this way, but also this way. There are now 12-step groups for procrastination, for cluttering, for gambling, for food. There are about 50 of them. So what Bill Wilson started, because he was trying to find a way to stop drinking, has expanded in these two amazing ways. The first Alcoholics Anonymous meeting I went to was in 1975. It was in the Presbyterian Church in Scarborough, New York, and I went with my father, who was a recovering alcoholic. Then, as you've already heard, in the year 2000, Time magazine decided to do this issue devoted to influential people of the 20th century. And they called me up and asked me to profile Bill Wilson. And I said to them, okay, send me all the books. And as you've heard, there really weren't any. There were a lot of things that hadn't been done. There were a lot of things that hadn't been said. So I thought that somebody should write a book about Bill Wilson. But of course, I didn't think it should be me. And then I had lunch with my agent, and I said to her, somebody should write a book about Bill Wilson, and she said to me, you should write a book about Bill Wilson, and so I did. And I wrote the profile of Bill Wilson, who certainly was, I came to see, one of the most influential men of the 20th century. Bill Wilson gave us a new way to think about addiction and a new way to think about alcohol. It's Bill Wilson who showed us that addiction is not a moral question. That's what people used to think, if you can believe that. That addiction is not a problem of self-control, but rather a disease with symptoms and treatment. And, you know, I happen to be writing about the Pilgrims. This is not in the speech, but I'm just riffing here. And they also have this problem that we have of thinking that drinking is great and drunkenness is terrible, right? So they say drinking is God's creature and drunkenness is from the devil. And they have a terrible time figuring out where that line is, right? Where this wonderful drinking turns into this dreadful drunkenness. But they don't know what to do about it. When they have a drunk, they put him in the stocks. They make him wear a big D on his chest, right? Until Bill Wilson, there was almost no real way to understand or engage with alcoholism. And it's just amazing, you know, even to me, that until the 1930s, really, if you were alcoholic, that was sort of it. Anyway, there were a couple of stories that stuck with me when I wrote the piece about Bill Wilson for Time magazine. One of them was his conviction that anonymity was a tremendously important part of the program that he started with Dr. Bob Smith. Now, anonymity started out as being just a way for people to avoid being known as alcoholics. There's a hilarious photograph of an early meeting in Cleveland. So it's all these men, clearly local businessmen in suits and felt hats, and they're all wearing black masks, as if that would disguise them, right? But at first, people didn't want to go to AA meetings or be part of AA because they thought that they didn't want their customers or their partners to know that they were alcoholics, and that was the beginning of anonymity. But it was part of Bill Wilson's genius. I was saying at dinner that I kind of fell in love with him, and I'm sure you'll hear that in my voice, that he realized anonymity could have a much broader scope, and that anonymity could really be a key for humility. That if people only address themselves as drunks if they didn't come into AA or come to him going, do you know who I am, right? That they would do better. And, you know, because Bill believed this so much, when they wanted Bill Wilson to be on the cover of Time in 1968, he said no. That would break my anonymity. I can't be on the cover of Time. And even more marked for me was when Yale University wanted to give him an honorary degree, he really wanted it. He got the letter from Yale and he was like, oh. So, but he knew he had to talk to a couple of other people before he accepted. So he asked his old friend Mark Whalen, who kind of made a face, and then he asked a couple of other people, and he slowly came to realize that he couldn't take the honorary degree from Yale as Bill Wilson. Because that would feed his arrogance, what he called his big shotism, and it would violate this principle of anonymity. So, you know, that's just one example of Bill Wilson taking something pretty simple, like I don't want the neighbors to know, and turning it into an incredible spiritual principle. Anyway, I was hooked, and I began writing my book about Bill Wilson. And so, Bill Wilson was, here we go, born in East Dorset, Vermont. And as you can see, on one side, in fact, the entire Bill Wilson story is visible in these shots, which I actually took, brilliant photography, of East Dorset, Vermont. So on one side, which is the top, you've got the Wilson house. And what you can't see is it's bright red. And it's got every architectural embellishment possible. It's now a hotel, actually, and it was a hotel then. And it's basically what a drunk would build if a drunk was building a big house, right? Everything you can have is on this house, and it's bright red, and there are like cats on the porch, and, you know, somebody's parked on the lawn. And then you've got the church in the middle of town, and then on the other side of church, you've got the Griffith House. Can I point this out to you? A little tiny, cramped, gray, puritanical house. So Bill Wilson's father grew up in the Wilson house, and Bill Wilson's mother grew up in the Griffith house. So you can see what the problem was right from the beginning. Anyway, they didn't get along. They had Bill, they had Dorothy, and they didn't get along for obvious reasons. One of them was a big, brilliant, lovable, blousy, philandering drunk. And the other one was a restrained, puritanical Mayflower descendant. I'm not sure what the noun should be. Provide the noun for me. And they didn't get along. And when Bill was just 11, his parents abandoned him. And they dumped him and his sister with his mother's parents, with his grandparents, who lived in that little tiny gray house at that side of the green. And that house was so small that when Bill Wilson walked down the stairs, he bumped his head. Oh, you can stay. Been there. And when he wanted to read in bed, he had to stick his feet out the window. That's how small that house was. So Bill Wilson, abandoned at age 11, built his life back up, read a lot, and won over his grandfather, which was not an easy task. And his grandfather sent him to a very fancy prep school in nearby Manchester, where he began to really get a top-notch education. And Bill Wilson excelled. He was an A student. He was the captain of the football team. He was always a great musician. He was a champion fiddler at Burr & Burton. He loved to fiddle the dances. And most of all, at Burr & Burton, he got the girl. He got the prettiest girl in the class, Bertha Bamford, who was the minister's daughter in Manchester, and he was divinely happy. And it looked as if he had overcome what happened to him in his childhood and fixed it. And Bertha went down to New York City for a small medical operation, and tragically she died when Bill was 17. He was inconsolable, and for the second time in his life, he completely crashed. People often ask me if Bill Wilson had a drinking problem. And the answer is yes. He was just one man trying to get sober. And the last thing he ever imagined was that he would start the incredible movement that he started. He had watched his father drink, and he had seen drinking at the Wilson House. And also because, and this is just another great piece of good luck about Bill Wilson, because he was going to school before Prohibition, they taught temperance in the schools in those days in Vermont. So he had been taught temperance, he had seen drunkenness, he knew a lot about it, and he decided that he would never drink. After Bertha died, he met Lois Burnham, who was a wealthy woman, 4 years older than he was, who went to East Dorset in the summers. And they became engaged, and then Bill Wilson dropped out of college. It was World War I, and joined the Army as a first lieutenant. And here he is as a first lieutenant, which, don't you love that picture? He's having fun, not drinking. And then there's his group. But for a guy who had swore that he would never drink, the Army was hard. Everybody was drinking. He had a lot of discomfort, and he wanted to drink. And surprise, he did. So I'm just going to read you the piece from the book. It's just 3 paragraphs where he has his first drink, because I think it's such an important thing. And as you know, I'm sure, one symptom of alcoholism is a vivid memory of your first drink. So this is Bill Wilson's first drink, and he's at a very fancy cocktail party in Newport in his uniform, but he feels totally uncomfortable. Secretly writhing, he began to think about making his escape from the party when one of the sisters appeared next to him. He tried to smile and avoid saying anything stupid. Then someone put a cocktail in his hand, a Bronx cocktail it was called. The sweet drink made of gin, dry and sweet vermouth, and orange juice shimmered in its glass. This was the new drink from New York, a pretty girl standing next to him said. She knew that he would love it. Bill Wilson was a man who had decided again and again that he would never drink. I'd been told how many of my ancestors went down with it, he remembered. Standing there, a tall young soldier in uniform with a full-scale war going on inside his head, he somehow felt as if he didn't have a choice. So now the man who had said he would never drink, the man whose life had already been ruined by others drinking, gratefully accepted the Bronx cocktail. This was different. This time its effect was unmistakable. It tasted wonderful, sweet and airy at the same time. Orange juice and gin are a time-honored drink because of the way they combine to relax and energize. It tasted so good that it was gone in what seemed like a moment. The second Bronx cocktail was what really did the trick. Suddenly, the gawky soldier felt completely at home in this fancy crowd. The pretty girl, his new best friend, guided him around, introducing him to her friends. Bill laughed and relaxed and told stories. Everyone laughed with him. And this is a quote from him. That strange barrier that had existed between me and all men and women, even the closest, seemed to instantly go down, he remembered. The scene went from being a nightmare to being beautiful. I could talk well. I could actually please the guests. Bill had ascended into the top ranks of society with just a few drinks, and he thought he had found the elixir of life. After he had been invited to return another time and made many new plans with his friends, he stepped out into the driveway of the house enthralled. Behind him, he could hear soft saxophone music. As he walked down the drive through the fragrant summer night, he moved as easily as if invisible chains had fallen away. He felt a new kind of freedom. I was part of things at last, he remembered. Oh, the magic of those first 3 or 4 drinks. So that's his first drink, and things begin to go bad pretty quickly. He's married to Lois Burnham, and she, of course, as the founder of Al-Anon, we know that she didn't notice much. But Bill noticed how hard it became increasingly hard for him not to drink. When they had a whole evening where he wasn't going to be able to drink, it was agony for him. And he gets out of the Army and he doesn't quite know what to do with himself. And that's where I think you can see the drink begin to take him. What do they say? The man takes the drink takes the man. There's a third part of that I've forgotten. But you can see the drink taking the man. From 1917 to 1934, he lost everything over and over again. He promised to stop, but he couldn't stop. For instance, he decided that he wanted to work at Thomas Edison's lab in New Jersey. Thomas Edison had set up this lab, and he invited, Bill saw an ad in the paper that said, do you want to come work for Thomas Edison? So he said, absolutely. So Thomas Edison had invented or was giving a kind of early SAT test where he gave a lot of young men a kind of general knowledge test. So Bill went out to the Edison labs in New Jersey, and he took the test, and he passed with flying colors. He was the kind of guy who knew everything. And Edison was really impressed, and Edison offered him a job tailor-made for him. And Bill said, it's too far away. So, to my mind, that's alcoholism. Then he decided he wanted to get a law degree, so he went and got the credits, but then he couldn't quite pick up the degree. He never quite graduated. So that kind of aspect of alcoholism that some of us know so well, where you have all these good intentions and then the whole thing just kind of disintegrates in your hands, that began to happen to him. Then he went to Wall Street, and because he was a born salesman, there he is on Wall Street, he did pretty well on Wall Street. He knew how to sell things, and it was the 1920s, and he knew how to buy things, and he realized that people on Wall Street were investing in companies that they didn't know very much about. So he came up with this harebrained scheme, which turned out to be pretty brilliant, which is that he would go to these companies and see what they were like and see how they were actually doing. So he and Lois bought a motorcycle with a sidecar and loaded it up with a bunch of books and spent 2 years going up and down the eastern seaboard researching these companies. And Bill would go to like if it was GE at Schenectady, for instance, he'd go to the local bar, he'd make friends, they'd invite him back to the plant, he'd see what was really going on. Or in other cases, he would even get a job at a company and work there for a while. And he was able to send this information back to Wall Street and get paid very well for it. It really was, here he is doing some of this market research. It really was a very successful ploy. But every time Bill Wilson got back on his feet, drinking would knock him down again. And finally, the family Bible of Bill and Lois's family, you can see every year he pledged at Christmas that he would never drink again. And that happens about 10 times. And the handwriting gets looser and looser and looser. And it got so bad that he just didn't want to live anymore. And now I'm reading again. Once they were back in Brooklyn, Bill's drinking got worse. He stole from Lois's purse to buy drinks and often thought of throwing himself out the window. One night, Lois found him dragging a mattress downstairs to the first floor. He was afraid to sleep on a higher floor because he thought he might jump. Life didn't seem worth living. By the fall of 1933, the situation seemed hopeless. So Lois Wilson's brother, Leonard Strong, had heard about a place on the Upper West Side of Manhattan called Towns Hospital, where they treated, quote-unquote, alcoholics. And so he offered to pay for it if Bill would go to Towns Hospital. What they mostly did at Towns Hospital in those days was dried you out and gave you big doses of drugs, which was really all anybody knew how to do. But Bill went to Towns Hospital, and incredible good luck. There was a guy working there called Dr. Duncan Silkworth who was fascinated by alcoholics. And of course, he was fascinated by Bill, but Dr. Silkworth started talking to Bill about alcoholism as if it were something you could understand and treat. Dr. Silkworth told Bill that he had an obsession of the mind and an allergy of the body. It was Dr. Silkworth who explained to Bill that if he had one drink, there was no controlling it. that it was, as we now say, the first drink that got him drunk. Bill left Towns Hospital the first time, and he thought, oh, that's great, I've got it now, I won't drink again, and of course he drank again. And that happened 3 times. But slowly, the pieces that would eventually become Alcoholics Anonymous were falling into place in Bill Wilson's mind, even though he didn't know it. One night he ran into an old friend on the street. He was horrified to find that the old friend wasn't drinking. And the old friend said, you've got to come to the Oxford group. It's this new thing. They're curing drunks. I haven't had a drink in 3 weeks or whatever it was. And so Bill went to the Oxford group and he thought, that's it, I'm cured. And then, of course, the next day he was drunk again. And the same thing happened at Calvary Church, but he kept trying. He kept trying. And but he learned about the power of the group, and he learned about admitting defeat. And everything he did, he learned from. And what happened to him, he had many pieces in place. The power of the group, the understanding that you had no control over it once you had had a drink. A lot of understanding of alcoholism that came from Dr. Silkworth. The idea that if you felt guilty about something, that would cause you to drink. Dr. Silkworth had said that to him. But what he didn't really have was any kind of idea that drinking had anything to do with God or religion or anything like that. He didn't have that yet. He didn't quite understand that piece yet. But on his 3rd visit to Towns Hospital, he fell on his knees and he called out to help. He said, God, if you're there, show yourself angrily. And his room, as he writes it, which I'm not going to read this part, was filled with this blazing white light, which Bill took to be the presence of God and the voice of God. And after that, Bill Wilson never had another drink. One of his discoveries that day was that although religion had nothing to do with it, staying sober did require, as he saw, some kind of change of heart, some kind of spiritual shift. He was reading William James, who wrote that the only cure for dipsomania is religomania. And also, much later in his life, Bill had a correspondence with Carl Jung. And Carl Jung wrote him this wonderful phrase that the only thing that works against alcoholism is spiritus contra spiritum. In other words, the spirit must defeat the spirits. How cool is that? Okay, so Wilson, of course, is only the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. Alcoholics Anonymous had another co-founder. And in the spring of 1935, Bill Wilson went to Akron, Ohio to try to sell some wire rope to the Goodyear Company. And he failed. The deal that he had gone to Akron to, make happen fell through. And he found himself in the lobby of the Mayflower Hotel, pacing back and forth, listening to the people in the bar. And of course, the people in the bar seemed to be just having a wonderful, wonderful time. Don't they always? And he could hear the clinking of the ice and the people chatting happily, and he really wanted to drink. He had not had a drink for 4 months at this point. And he somehow knew, yet another little piece, that the one thing that would help him is if he could help another alcoholic. So in the lobby of the Mayflower Hotel, there was a list there actually still is, because of course this is now famous, a list of local churches. And Bill started calling these local churches and saying, do you have a drunk I could work on? He would say, I'm a rum hound from New York and I'm looking for a drunk. Or he would say, anyway, he finally, through a series of failures, and one thing Bill was, he endured. He just kept trying, whatever it was. So he just kept trying. And in the end, he ended up in a guest cottage of the Goodyear estate with a doctor, Dr. Bob Smith, who was losing everything because he could not stop drinking. Bob Smith was a proctologist. And Bill, by this time, knew a little bit about how to talk to drunks about alcoholism. Duncan Silkworth had said to him, "Don't preach." So he sat down with Dr. Bob Smith, and he didn't talk about Dr. Bob Smith. He talked about Bill Wilson. And also, both these men were from Vermont. Here they were in this weird half-Tudor house in Akron, Ohio, but they had a lot in common. And Dr. Bob had said, "Oh, let him talk to me for 15 minutes and that's it," right? But of course, they talked for hours. And you know, Dr. Bob was in many ways the perfect balance for Bill Wilson. Bill Wilson was a man of intense enthusiasms, and this ended up getting him in some trouble. He just thought if it was great, it was super great. And Dr. Bob was a much calmer guy, very, very Christian guy, both chain smokers, by the way. And talk about coffee. But he kind of anchored Bill. You know, Bill would think something was a great idea, you know, a new AA hospital or some rich person who wanted to give them a lot of money, and Bob would say, no, wait a minute, let's think about this. So together, they were kind of the perfect organism. And after Bob's death, Bill Wilson realized that before Bob died, what happened was Bill gets sober, Bob gets sober, and then Bill goes back to New York, and 2 years later, Bill went back to visit Bob in Akron, Ohio, and they sat down and they realized that between them, they had gotten about 40 people sober. And it was at that moment that they both went, wait a minute, we've got something here. It's not just that we're not drinking. We're helping other people. A lot of people aren't drinking. And so Bill, with the enthusiast, said, well, let's write a book that tells people who we don't know everything that we know. So they met about it and they talked about it, and Bill got permission to write a book. So he went back to New York and started working on the book, which is called Alcoholics Anonymous. And it's an amazing book. It's also called The Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And Bill would write a chapter, and then he would send it around. By this time, there were a lot of other editors and writers, not that those people drink more than other people, who were part of this association. And it was kind of a group effort. But Bill would start, and then it would be taken over. And then after Dr. Bob died, Bill decided that there should be another book, a book that both expands on the steps and lays out what are really the bylaws of Alcoholics Anonymous, the traditions, the book that we call the 12 and 12. So Bill wrote that with a couple of other people. And, both of these men were amazed at what happened to their idea, which had really been an idea that was about them and their lives, and how could they possibly stop drinking, because they had tried everything. So to go back to Bill, Bill was certainly not the perfect man, as I've said, but he was the perfect man for the job of starting AA. He had a practical background. He grew up as a quarryman's son in a small town. Oh, I must have forgotten some pictures, right? Yikes. Oops, nope, sorry. Well, no, not yet, okay. Forget you saw that. In a small Vermont town, and in Vermont, in that small town, he was schooled in grassroots democracy. Because in Vermont small towns, they have town meetings, everybody has a vote. It's, as Bill wrote, democracy is not on top, the leader is not on top, he's on tap. And so he grew up in a place where a very strong belief was that everybody needed to have an equal voice in government. And that's what he programmed into AA. He also, as I mentioned, had gone to school when temperance was taught in the schools, and when it was a big deal. He saw an uncle of his take a temperance pledge, and when they taught temperance, they taught what they knew about alcoholism, which wasn't much, but he was very aware, and he had lived through Prohibition, that Prohibition didn't work, that temperance as he had known it didn't work. So he knew that they had to find another way. And his mind had also been opened by adversity. He was an extraordinarily humble man. He really understood that anything you have can just disintegrate in a second, because that had happened to him again and again. Yet, as I said, he was a chain smoker. He couldn't stop smoking. He died of emphysema. And his LSD story, he took LSD before those Harvard guys, Alpert and Leary, had discovered it, or they had discovered it, but it wasn't illegal yet. But Bill was very good friends with Aldous Huxley, right? Those two guys got along really well, as you can imagine. And they helped start a weird, quote unquote, university, nothing like this university, in the desert of Southern California. They didn't actually have buildings or faculty, but they would all go there and sort of talk to each other. And then when they got hold of some LSD, they would all go there and take LSD. And Bill loved LSD. He urged his mother to take some, and she did. And then he thought he would try to use LSD as a way to stop smoking, because he knew he had to stop smoking, right? And so there's a hilarious transcript where he has a doctor and Huxley's feeding him LSD, and he starts getting, whatever we're going to call it, high, disoriented, and he says, "Oh, I'll never smoke again. I'll never smoke again." It's 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, and then it wears off, and he's like, "Can I have a cigarette?" So clearly, it didn't work. And as for Bill's philandering, he certainly had one mistress, Helen Wynne, and probably many others. And when I was on the road for this book, there were many people who said to me, how can you like him if he cheated on his wife? How can this be? He's a monster. One of the NPR interviewers said to me, he's a monster. He abandoned his family. And what I said about that, and this is what I believe, is that Bill and Lois were married for 53 years. He was 17 when they met. And they stayed good friends. So however they did that, it's not my business. I mean, I don't feel that I can judge that marriage. We just don't know. Lois might have said to him, go for it. I mean, we just have no idea. So that's how I find a way to forgive him that. And one of the most, how am I doing? You stopped laughing after the joke. You're supposed to keep laughing. There we go. Okay, so one of the most controversial, I'm realizing that the PowerPoint isn't exactly evenly spaced, is it? Unless you're drunk, maybe. Okay. Okay, one of the most controversial parts of my book and of Bill Wilson's story was that he, after 38 years of sobriety, asked for a drink on his deathbed. And here's how I found that out. And here's for the last 30 years of their life, Bill and Lois, here they are in happy days, lived in this house in Bedford Hills called Stepping Stones, where you should go if you're ever in the neighborhood, Bedford Hills, Westchester County. And because they lived there so long, Stepping Stones has an incredible archive. Everything that Bill and Lois collected, all their letters, all their napkins, all their books, everything is there. And in fact, in the house, talk about clutter, there's still, all their stuff is still there. So when I went to write this book, I was very, very lucky. The archive at Stepping Stones had not yet really been indexed. There had been one archivist and he didn't work out, and then there was another one and they didn't work out. So when I first went there was no index, there was just this room full of boxes. But I kept going there and I made friends with them, how you do when you're a biographer. And then about a year in or 2 years in, they hired an archivist. And she and I got along great. So I got to watch her index this archive and go through every piece of it with her. And one day I got, so here are Bill and Lois at Stepping Stones. You can see how nice it is. And there they are at Stepping Stones again. So one day I went out to Stepping Stones on the train to Bedford Hills, and I get to the archives, and my friend the archivist says, I have something that might interest you. And I say, okay. So she brings out these nurses' logs, and they're very wide and high, right? And they're green, and there are about 5 of them. So I start flipping through, and at the end of his life, Bill Wilson had 2 male nurses, and they made notations every hour, or if anything odd happened. So I start reading through these nurses' logs, and I guess I'm just going to read you this part. Pretty soon, So I start reading through these nurses' logs, and when I get to the first place where Bill asks for a drink, I go, and the archivist says, "I thought you'd like that." So I'm going to read you this piece, and you'll get the names of the nurses too, Dannenberg and O'Loughlin. On James Dannenberg's log for December 25th, Bill Wilson's last Christmas day, at 6:10 in the morning after a long night, the patient asked for 3 shots of whiskey. He also noted that Wilson was quite upset when he couldn't have what he asked for. There was no whiskey at Stepping Stones. A few days later, Bill Wilson became belligerent and tried to punch the nurse. On the 2nd of January, Bill asked Nurse O'Loughlin, the other nurse, for a shot of whiskey. He didn't get one. The next day, he was more cheerful. He told Dannenberg that he was determined to be ready for walks in Vermont in February. On January 4th, Bill and the nurses listened to President Nixon's State of the Union speech on the radio. Just so you know, he dies on January 24th, so this is really the last chapter. The country was in turmoil. Student demonstrations against the Vietnam War had torn neighborhoods and families apart. The previous spring, when Bill could still come downstairs for an occasional walk, 4 students were killed by the National Guard at Kent State. On the 7th of January, Nurse Dannenberg noted that Bill had been visited by some family members, and that after the visit, he and Lois had an angry argument. The next morning, Bill again asked him for whiskey. Instead of complying, Dannenberg sat down and asked Bill if he wanted to talk. Bill described his marital difficulties and complained about Lois. Dannenberg sympathized. Bill wept. And this is all in these logs. By the 14th of January, Bill Wilson, a man who hadn't had a drink in almost 37 years, a man who had discovered what is still the only successful way to treat alcoholism, was asking for whiskey again. He was an alcoholic. Alcoholics drink. They love to drink, and for a long time, drinking works for them. Some discover, as Bill had, that it is almost impossible for them to stop drinking. Many never stop wanting to drink. It's a measure of the power of alcohol that even in his last days alive, Bill Wilson still wanted a whiskey. So that's where that came from. Those logs are still there. And this is Bill in 1970, so that's a year before he dies. And I think you can see, of course, you can't see him struggling for breath, but you can almost see that tension in his face. So he died on his wedding anniversary, January 24th of emphysema in 1971. They had gone to Miami to try to get a doctor to help him with his lungs, and he died in Miami. So as you can see, Bill Wilson was no saint in the sense that he wasn't perfect. But it was his humanity, his imperfection, his search for some kind of peace in his own life that led him to find a way that has helped millions of people and that has changed the way we think about our own natures and about addiction. Or maybe that, what I just read, is the definition of a saint. Thank you.
Do we have questions for Susan? Yes, here's one.
Yes, you said he was cured from drinking by a religious conversion.
Okay.
A spiritual conversion, he saw light, et cetera, et cetera. Is that a big part of Alcoholics Anonymous? Is religion a part of that?
Can you all hear that question? You got it? For him, It was. He called out to God, G-O-D, God. But this is one of the things I fell in love with. He knew that what happened to him wasn't going to be right for everybody else. And so Alcoholics Anonymous says to you, you can believe in whatever you want. And he actually, the third step, made a decision to turn my life and my will over to the care of God as I understand God. So they put that in the steps so that it's not Bill Wilson's God that you need to have anything to do with, or Bill Crawley's God. It's whatever you decide is God. And some alcoholics just go with a group of drunks. The group is their God. I have a friend whose name is Carmine, and he says, my higher power is Carmine. One of the other biographers of Bill Wilson, a wonderful guy called Ernie Kurtz, wrote a book called Not God, meaning your God can be anything but you. So it can be a radiator, it can be a dog, it can be a cat, it just can't be you. And I think that was Bill Wilson's point in writing the steps, is that as long as you're in charge, you're in trouble. So it's not a religious program. It doesn't require any particular kind of God. And in fact, there are a lot of funny jokes about the different, as you can see, the different things that people decide to use as their higher power. But that is how it happened to him. And Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob Smith were both white, male Christians. And there's no way around that, you know, but what they discovered works for a lot of other people too.
A question here.
Yes, can you tell us more about the connection between Bill Wilson, Alcoholics Anonymous, and Oxford University, and how that started there? I understand that there was a group called Moral Rearmament that came out of that as well. Can you?
Yeah, here's what happened. A guy named Dr. Frank Buckman started a group called the Oxford Group, which he named the Oxford Group just because he thought it sounded good. It had no affiliation with Oxford University. And in fact, later, Oxford University specifically asked him to not call it the Oxford Group, but I haven't gotten to that part yet. So he started it in the early 30s, say, and the idea of it was some kind of spiritual enlightenment. And it had something called the Four Absolutes, which maybe someone in the audience knows, you know, honesty, there you go. And Frank Buckman, in my opinion, was very interested in money. He had big Oxford group weekends, often for very wealthy people. And Bill Wilson's friend Ebby Thatcher got involved with the Oxford group, and they got him sober. And so he took Bill Wilson to the Oxford group, and Bill Wilson got sober for a moment with the Oxford group, but he often said that the Oxford group had helped him a lot, and Dr. Bob Smith was a member in good standing of the Oxford group, and many of the people in Akron were in the Oxford group. What happened then, maybe you know more about this than I do, is that Frank Buckman seemed to destabilize, is that the polite word? Anyway, he started to go around saying who he thought were key people, and his focus on money, it seems to me, got more and more keen. And essentially, Bill Wilson had been having Tuesday night Oxford group meetings at his house in Brooklyn, which were really Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. And the Oxford group people got sick of the alcoholics, because the alcoholics were a rowdy bunch with no money. And when you had a bunch of alcoholics come over, shoes through the window, the whole thing. And they had no money. So the Oxford group tagline was, "Are you maximum?" And Frank Buckman decided that Bill Wilson was not maximum. Maximum. He was not maximum. And in fact, although that seemed devastating at the time to Bill Wilson and this fledgling group of people he was with, it turned out well, because then Frank Buckman decided that somebody he really wanted to recruit very badly was Adolf Hitler, who Frank Buckman, thought was a terrific guy. And so he didn't succeed in, so Frank Buckman just went somewhere that it's just as well that Bill Wilson didn't go. And then it got named Moral Rearmament, I think after Oxford asked them to, and it may still be going. But AA's connection with it ended when Frank Buckman kicked them out because they were so rowdy and poor. So, but it's a very interesting, someone should write a book about the Oxford group because it's a very interesting group. And as I say, Bill Wilson often said how much he learned from them.
What kind of cooperation did you get from the infrastructure of Alcoholics Anonymous? Did you get any help from them?
Well, the GSO, as it's now called, the General Service Organization, as you may or may not know, Alcoholics Anonymous has no leaders. Everybody rotates. But there are a few people who don't rotate as fast as I might wish they did. And I'm going to get in trouble for that. This does not leave this room, okay? So some of those people, AA has a very beautiful headquarters on Upper Riverside Drive in Manhattan, and they have an archive there. So I had to apply to see the archive, and I applied to the then archivist, whose name was Judith Santon, and I had to go through a whole rigmarole, and I got permission to use the archive. Now, they weren't so wonderful about it. It wasn't like the Stepping Stones archive where I could just walk right in there and say, what do you got? But they did open the archive to me, so that's cooperation. They didn't, that was all I needed from them, really.
Sort of grudging cooperation, it sounds like.
Right?
Sort of grudging cooperation. They didn't seem to be embracing you too much. Other questions? Come on.
Do you find it curious, he found a method to stop drinking so that alcohol didn't kill him, and yet he didn't apply that to what did kill him, smoking?
I know. I mean, that's not a question. How could he not see that he could use those same principles that he had used to stop drinking, to stop smoking? How could he not see that? I don't, I just think that it's like the Pilgrims in a way. It's impossible to be there with him and to know how the world looked to him and to know why he didn't see that. But that we can see it is meaningless. Come on. Look at our advantages. But he just couldn't see it. He just couldn't see it, and it's pretty sad.
Hi, I actually met you many years ago when I attended Briarcliff College, and I just wanted to say how impressed I was. I'm an EMT, and at Ground Zero after 9/11, the Red Cross had a building, and they had every day 2 meetings of Bill W., and to this day that still impresses me. That's all I wanted to say.
It's impressive. Yeah. Oh, wait. Bill has to choose.
I just wanted to ask you how the concept of camaraderie got going in a nation where most is more characteristic of individualism. How that was able to turn that around and get people to meet and be together so much. Thank you.
Well, I think one way that Bill and Bob were able to bring people together in an age and in a country, actually, that values individualism so tremendously is their incredible, I don't even know what to call it, the openness. In other words, there aren't any rules in AA. You can do whatever you want. You can get there late. You can leave early. You can bring your dog. You can bring your mother. You can you can do a cartwheel in the aisle. In other words, they were very careful, and I think this was Bill's influence to make sure that it was wide. You can drink in AA. Plenty of people drink and come to AA meetings, and that's fine. So by leaving it that wide open, he allowed people to come together. In other words, as I've often heard, if it was the Bill Gates AA or if it was the AA you can't wear pink, nobody would go. But he understood that, that there's no limit to the defiance of an alcoholic. And so that therefore you have to create a situation in which no defiance is possible.
Susan, we have a question back here.
Hi, Susan. Great book. it actually helped inspire a history buff meeting that got started here in Fredericksburg. But the question was, a friend seemed to get the inference from your book that Bill Wilson's spiritual experience might have borrowed heavily from his grandfather's spiritual experience upon the mountain. I didn't get that at all, but he seemed to have. Did you intend that, or?
No, it wasn't his grandfather, it was his uncle.
His
Anyway.
uncle. What happened?
I'm not even sure it was his uncle. When Bill Wilson, they used to have these temperance meetings in East Dorset, and he saw somebody, rise up and say, "Oh my God, I've heard the voice of God, and I'm never going to drink again." And it was actually Bill who then walked up Mount Aeolus and thought about that. So there's a little conflation going on there. But I think his white light experience, I think it was genuine. He was very skeptical of it. He immediately said to Dr. Silkworth, am I just tripping? And Dr. Silkworth said, no, but the proof is in the pudding, right? He didn't drink again. So whatever happened to him, no matter how bogus it was, it worked, because he was a guy who drank.
Hi.
Yes. Hi.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Al-Anon. Didn't you say his wife helped start that?
Sure, I don't even see where you are. Hi. Yes, Lois, of course, was incredibly long-suffering the whole time Bill was drinking. And then what she found to her amazement was it was almost as hard to get along with him sober as it had been to get along with him drunk. In fact, it was a little harder. So she found herself in a rage a lot of the time against him, and she, being a smart woman, said to herself, how can this be, right? He's not drinking. This is what I've been saying I wanted all this time. And so she started a program called Al-Anon for the families of alcoholics, and it's an extraordinary program. I was just telling Bill and Terry that after my father got sober, my father died in 1982, and I often said to him, although he was dead, why did you not take my mother to Al-Anon? She needs Al-Anon. You knew about Al-Anon. You were sober in AA. You should have taken her to Al-Anon. But of course he didn't answer because he was dead. But he did answer, because when I told my mother that I was writing a book about Bill Wilson, she said to me, oh, Bill Wilson, she said, your father used to take me over to see that Lois woman all the time at Stepping Stones, right? My parents live in Westchester, and I hated her. So I then had to say to my father's ghost, okay, you tried. I guess Lois said to my mother, I know what you've been through. And my mother said, you have no idea what I've been through. So it wasn't a successful Al-Anon graft, but I think Al-Anon is a wonderful, wonderful program, and doesn't get enough respect.
Question is back here.
The gentleman up front kind of stole my thunder when he talked about the smoking and why he couldn't overcome that habit. But you would think that we would learn from the Bill Wilson example in terms of, I've heard of Gamblers Anonymous. What about Drugs Anonymous? What about
There's everything.
Smoking Anonymous? I've never heard of anything like that.
There are 50 programs, 50, for almost everything you can imagine. There's gamblers, there's narcotics, there's also drugs, there's 3 programs for sex. Actually, there are 2 for gambling. I mean, there's 1 for procrastination, there's 1 for smoking, or maybe 2 for smoking. I mean, there are 50. So really, these steps have been used for almost every kind of addiction, which I think is like an incredible thing, and something Bill Wilson obviously wouldn't have dreamt of, but more of the power in the ideas that he had, and more of, I really think he changed the way we see ourselves, the way we see human nature, very much in the way Freud did. And that's the core of it. I mean, people now have some way to understand addictive behavior, some way to identify it, and some way to treat it. But yeah, there are programs for almost anything you can think of. Yes. Oh, sorry, yes.
Hi. You you said that Bill Wilson talked to a lot of influential people, namely Carl Jung, the important psychologist, and you seem to imply that there is some kind of like dialogue. Could you elaborate on that?
There are a couple of letters. It's not a lot. A friend of Bill's in Vermont got arrested and went to study with Jung, thinking that studying with Jung would cure his alcoholism, and it didn't. But later in his life, at Stepping Stones, Bill wrote a letter to Carl Jung, talking to him about alcoholism and about his treatment of this friend. And Jung wrote back this famous letter, which is on the wall of Bill's study at Stepping Stones, that says, you know, the only thing I've ever seen that can work against alcoholism is some kind of change of heart, some kind of spiritual experience. And then, you know, he says, spiritus contra spiritum, which I just think is so cool.
All right, we have a question. Go ahead, you in the middle, go ahead.
With everything you've learned from his story, how has it affected your life? And if we were to walk away and forget everything you said tonight, what's that one message that Bill wants us to never forget?
That's a really hard question. How did it affect my life? Well, I sort of fell in love with him. So it gave me, you know, just another person to look up to and learn from. I just was so impressed by him. I mean, I was saying at dinner, you know, he had these horrible parents, and yet, and his mother would write him a birthday letter every year, which would start out, "Dear Bill, I'm writing to celebrate your birthday. I remember your birth. You know, it was cold. I was miserable. We almost died." And then it would go on, and it would say, you know, "You're the cross I've had to bear, and you know, you've really drained me in every way." Every year she churned out one of these hateful letters. And he would write her back and say, you know, "Dear Mom, I hope you'll come stay with us." I mean, amazing, right? "I don't have much money right now, but I'm sending you a little check." I mean, who does that? And I just learned that you could be more forgiving than you had imagined. So that's one thing I learned from him. But the thing about him, and I guess it's part of that just still knocks me out, is that openness. You know, that idea that everybody gets to pick their own God. You know, that idea that saying, you know, when our kids say, "Nobody tells me what to do," we tell them they shouldn't say that. But he's like, it's okay to say that. I'm not going to tell you what to do. You know, there's this incredible openness at the heart of AA and of Bill Wilson that just, I don't know if it's really the takeaway, as we say these days, but it gives me something to aspire to.
Time for one more question.
Yes, you mentioned the book 12 Steps and 12 Traditions, which I understand was edited by a fellow by the name of Tom Powers, who probably wrote most of it.
Oh.
But there was a fall. Do you have any information on the falling out of Bill Wilson and Tom Powers?
I do. Do you want it? What? It's not such a good story. I went and interviewed Tom Powers. He was still alive. And here's what Tom Powers says. Bill Wilson was a crook and a thief and a sex addict. And he, Tom Powers, who is none of those things, but who had at that time married for the third time somebody 20 years younger than he was, could not put up with Bill's behavior anymore. And so he left Chappaqua and Tom Powers started his own program in Callicoon, New York, and he called it AAA. And he sat there on a mountaintop for the rest of his life and said hateful things about Bill Wilson. And I have to say, when I was interviewing him, I wanted to say to him, he was 91, I wanted to say, "Tom, you're going to see him soon. What are you going to say to him, you know?" But I didn't. But it was just, I don't know. I mean, as Bill Wilson would be the first to say, everyone can have their own opinion, you know, but I don't think Tom Powers wrote most of the 12 and 12, but I have to tell you, I know the 12 and 12 very, very well, and there are moments, especially in 5, 7, and 9, where I believe I hear his voice. And it's that part of the 12 and 12, I don't know how many of you know what I'm talking about here, where there's scolding. We did this wrong, and we did that wrong, and we did the other thing wrong. So this may just be my imagination, but I think those are the parts, because that's not how Bill Wilson saw things. Anyway, that's my Tom Powers story. May he rest in peace.
Well, before we say thanks and good night to Susan, let me invite everybody back Thursday. 2 nights from now, Paul Hendrickson is going to be here to talk about Ernest Hemingway based on his book, Hemingway's Boat. Should be very interesting. I hope you'll join us for that. Now join me in saying thank you to Susan Cheever.